Okay, this wiki reading, this is gonna put me on the map. The Third War for Armageddon. Armageddon is an imperial hive world in the Armageddon sector of the Segmentum Solar, with an estimated population between 100 billion, I think, and 500 billion people. I'm just saying billion because I don't know numbers. I can only count to 4. What do you want from me? The massive trade and industrial output of Armageddon makes it a vital part of the Imperium, particularly for its tightly settled worlds of the Segmentum Solar, the very heart of human-settled space. The Third War for Armageddon began exactly 57 standard years to the day after the start of the Second War for Armageddon in 998. And it saw the return of the Orc hordes to Armageddon under the control of the infamous warlord Gazgul Mak Uruk-Traka. He brought with him the forces of 3 other major Orc warlords, the great despot of Degruk, Urgok the Unstoppable, and the Overfiend of Octarius. They each commanded vast greenskin forces led by many other Orc war bosses to create the greatest Orc war ever faced by the Imperium of Man. Gazgul proved to be the most dangerous of Orc leaders, one with both drive and actual ability in abundance. A serious head injury in his youth awoke his visions from the Orc gods Gork and Mork, which led him on a bloody path of conquest unmatched by any Orcs in recent Imperial history. He returned to Armageddon for his rematch after decades of planning and testing Imperial defenses, and succeeding in unifying dozens of Orc tribes and even contingents from several different Orc empires, a level of unity among the Greenskins that had never been faced by the Imperium before. If, of course, we forget the Beast Arises, the War of the Beast, but it doesn't matter. The Orcs regroup. Orcs are never beaten in battle. We can always come back for another go. Classic Orc saying. Gazgul had not been an idle Orc following his defeat in the Second War for Armageddon. Retiring his stronghold in a network of Orc-controlled star systems in the Golgotha sector, he carried on with the master plan that had been divinely revealed to him by the Orc gods Gork and Mork solar decades before. If the Imperium had made one terrible mistake following the Second War for Armageddon, it was to believe that Gazgul had actually been defeated. In true, what the Orc gods had revealed to the war boss, or at least what he said they revealed, was that in order to truly destroy one's foe, you first had to learn all about him. For Gazgul, the Second War had simply been a way to learn how the Imperium would react and defend against a major Orc planetary invasion. In effect, Gazgul believed that the first invasion had been nothing more than a test of the Imperium of Man's defenses. In the 5 solar decades that followed the Second War for Armageddon, Gazgul carried on uninterrupted with his divinely inspired plan. Having learned all he needed to know about the Imperial tactics and strategy, he began developing the tactics that he felt would lead to his enemy's ultimate defeat. As he did not want to draw attention to himself, these experiments were carried out on a much smaller stage than the invasion of Armageddon. From 945 until 959, the Imperium received numerous reports of small Orc raids and attacks against Imperial bases and outposts that were led by Gazgul Traka personally. In 962, an Imperial military base on the world of Buka 3 was destroyed by missile fired from an Orc base hidden within an asteroid. The asteroid entered the SAR system from deep space and bypassed all the Imperial sensors because of its seemingly inert nature before unleashing its potent missiles at the unsuspecting outpost. In 972, the Imperial agri-world of Chigon 17 was overrun by a huge force of Orcs, also allegedly under war boss Gazgul's direct command. Despite the fact that Saigon's Imperial Guard defenders were equipped with tanks and other armored vehicles, they were decisively beaten by the Orcs in a lengthy guerrilla campaign, which rendered the powerful but static Imperial defenses wholly useless. In 986, the Imperial Navy battlecruiser Radiant Way and its escorts were lost with all hands in one attack by Orc pirates, again led by Gazgul. The Imperium responded in force, but discovered that all signs of the Orc presence had simply disappeared by the time they arrived in that region of space. Just before the outbreak of the Third War for Armageddon, Ghazghul allied with the Bad Moon Orcs warlord Nazdreg Urdgrub to launch an assault on the Imperial world of Pishchina IV. The Orcs used previously unknown form of teleportation technology that let them maneuver their troops directly onto the planet from a space hulk located a large distance away from the planet. The Imperial garrison was taken completely by surprise, and only the presence of the Space Marines from the Dark Angels chapter saved Pishchina from being overrun by the Greenskins. However, this defeat proved to be of little consequences for Ghazghul, as the completion and testing of his new teleporta by the Orc genius later dubbed Orchimendes by the Imperium meant that he was finally ready to unleash his full force against the Imperium. After more than 50 years, Ghazghul and his orcs intended to have their revenge. Reconstruction of Armageddon. Following Ghazghul's first invasion of Armageddon, a long investigation of the planet's readiness and defenses was begun in 948. In light of the strategic value of Armageddon to the Imperium, extensive works were ordered by the Adeptus Terra to secure the Armageddon system against any further attack. The Imperial Navy's sector command was transferred to the Armageddon system, and the naval facility of St. John's Dock was rebuilt and expanded to accommodate all classes of Imperial warships. 3 permanently manned monitoring stations were established in the outer reaches of the star system, named after 3 of the greatest heroes of the Second War for Armageddon: Mannheim, Dante, and Yarick. Ground-based and orbital defenses were rebuilt and heavily reinforced. Gravitic minefields were seeded throughout the star system, and a substantial increase in the numbers of sublight systems defense ships and monitors was ordered. On Armageddon itself, the long process of reconstructing the hive cities destroyed by Ghazghul's first invasion was begun. This was a process that was still ongoing over 50 Terran years later. In part, the slowness of the construction was caused by the increased number of planetary defense force regiments that were raised over this period, despite a lowering of Armageddon's tide of regiments destined for the Astra Militarum. A military council was appointed by the Administratum to rule over Armageddon, and was made up of high-ranking officials of the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the Departamento Monitorum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, and the governor of each of the major hive cities on Armageddon, a who's who of councils. The council was led by General Kurov. The council was led by General Kurov of the Imperial Guard, a respected veteran of the Bacchus Crusade. From 949 to 978, General Kurov coordinated a series of genocidal campaigns conducted throughout the equatorial jungles between Armageddon Prime and Secundus, and on the frozen planet of Chosin to eliminate feral orc infestations which had sprung up in the aftermath of Ghazghul's invasion. 50 standard years had passed, and Armageddon slowly rose from the ashes, his defense stronger and more powerful than ever before. Still, it would not prove to be enough to face the green storm that was coming. The first sign of that coming conflagration was a series of orc attacks on the star system surrounding Armageddon and other Imperial worlds nearby. First, the nearby world of Minerva suffered from the depredation of orc pirates. Then, the agri world of Ruiz was likewise assailed by the Greenskins. Over a period of solar months, in spite of the heroic efforts of the Imperial Navy, the number of Imperial merchant starships reaching Armageddon was cut in half. Someone seemed to understand that the Imperial forces in the sector were bound by the need to guard the Armageddon system, and were not free to patrol the rest of the sector as freely as they normally would. Almost immediately, the orc pirate raids grew into assaults on Imperial outposts, and then into attacks against lightly held Imperial colonies. Soon, the first full-scale planetary invasion began. 24 Imperial worlds came under attack from orcs in as many hours, and the astropaths of Armageddon received reports of yet more orc invasions and atrocities. Every consultation of the Emperor's Tarot prophesied only enormous amounts of bloodshed to come, and the sign of the beast resurgent. Rumors spread that Ghazghul was returning to have his vengeance. And soon, even the most obstinate administratum adept could no longer deny that an orc war of gargantuan proportions was engulfing the entire Armageddon sector of the Segmentum Solar. After the Imperial Navy's task force Trajan was presumed lost battling the orcs in the Descenda system, General Kurov sent an astropathic call for assistance to nearby Astra Militarum regiments and Space Marine chapters to come to the defense of Armageddon once more. Return of the Beast. It is with great regret that I must confirm that the Greenskin menace has again returned to Armageddon. 3 of our monetary stations already lie destroyed, and it is now impossible to ascertain their exact location, though I can say with certainty that they will be more here soon, and in some numbers. Admiral Parole. On the day of the feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 998, 55 standard years to the day after the first orc invasion of Armageddon, Augur's psychic probes registered a massive disruption in the warp as an orc fleet emerged back into real space, and Ghazghul's greenskin horde descended on Armageddon once more. An alert from the Imperial Monitor Station Dante was cut off mid-transmission as the orc starships swept past in their hundreds upon ramshackle hundreds. The monitor station's final Vox reports indicated that an orc fleet was moving into the Armageddon system, compromising 50 orc cruisers and over 300 escort vessels, accompanied by at least 4 Space Hulks. The Imperial forces of Armageddon were placed on full alert, and 7 Imperial Navy cruiser squadrons, led by the Apocalypse-class battleship His Will and Triumph, departed St. John's Deck in geostationary orbit of Armageddon within 24 hours of the first reports of the orc invasion. The Imperial fleet under the command of Admiral Parole entered battle 5 days later, catching the lead elements of the orc fleet in an ambush around the high-gravity world of Pellucidar. 60 orc attack ships were blasted out of the vacuum by Imperial fire in the initial engagement, without the loss of a single Imperial starship. Then, Admiral Parole's vessels were engaged by a heavy squadron of orc kill cruisers and swarms of fighter boomers racing ahead of the main body of the orc fleet. The Imperial starships fought valiantly, their weapon batteries pounding the crewed orc vessels into scrap, ravening lance beams incinerating wave after wave of fighter boomers. Nevertheless, the orc fleet outnumbered the Imperial Navy's defenders of Armageddon by 6-1, and the Imperial starships were gradually pushed back. The orcs made suicidal runs against the Imperial gunners with unbridled ferocity, losing a dozen of their ships in exchange for a single Imperial vessel. At the height of the engagement, Admiral Parole received bursts from the Yarick and Mannheim monitor stations warning that 3 more entire orc fleets were entering the edge of the star system. At the exact same moment, the Triumph was hit by a combined firepower of 5 orc kill cruisers and crippled by its heavy fire and mass orc teleport boarding attacks. Realizing that his duty lay in preserving the Imperial fleet for what would be a protracted conflict, Admiral Parole reluctantly gave the order for general retreat. The doomed Imperial monitor stations were overwhelmed by the orcs a few hours later. By their last count, the combined orc fleet entering Armageddon numbered in excess of 2,000 starships and at least 12 Space Hulks, the largest number of Space Hulks ever to assail a world of the Imperium in its 10,000-year history. Admiral Parole, his command reduced to just 5 squadrons of cruisers and a single battleship, could do little more than mount hit-and-run attacks against the massive orc armadas as they moved in system. Imperial reinforcements would later arrive, and then Parole hoped that the orcs' command of space could be challenged with more of a chance for success. As they waited, Parole's escort and light cruisers harried the orcs as best they were able, distracting and drawing off their foes into traps and gravitic minefields. To their dismay, the Imperial Navy vessels encountered dozens of crude asteroid fortresses, or rooks, in the normally vulnerable rear of the orc fleets. These incredibly heavily armored weapon platforms proved difficult to assault directly, but the very presence of such large numbers of rooks seemed to indicate a complexity of strategic planning among the orcs that had not yet been seen by the Imperium's defenders. Surprisingly, the orcs did not turn aside to capture the orbital St. John's dock. Instead, they bombarded it for 6 days as the orc fleets moved past and lived by repeated attacks from Imperial assault boat squadrons. Orc warriors succeeded in establishing themselves through the lower sections of the dock, and though the facility remained under Imperial control, it was rendered virtually useless as a dock for warships by damage from the bombardment and constant orc raids. Only the arrival of 2 Inquisitorial Ordo Xenos Death Watch Space Marine kill teams later in the campaign succeeded in driving the orcs back to the isotope storage pits at the base of the orbital station. Ground assault. Have I ever seen such scum as this before? Yes, the last time they came here. Has it been so long that you young ones don't remember, or are you simply too stupid to know who I am? Commissar Yarrick. In the final few solar weeks before the orc forces landed on Armageddon proper, the planet was in a frenzy of activity. Imperial Titans powered up their ancient plasma reactors and took up the defensive positions around the hive cities. Imperial Guard regiments were mustered and dug in. Space Marines from over 20 chapters moved into the mountains and wastelands to prepare to face the Greenskins. Imperial merchant vessels were commandeered and used daily to run supplies and reinforcements to the planet through the besieging orc fleet despite the risk. The very last transport to touch down carried a legend to the people of the world, the Old Man himself, Imperial Commissar Yarrick. The population cheered as, for the first time in 20 years, Yarrick stepped foot on Armageddon. The Commissar was met with the military council that governed Armageddon that night and advised them on Gazgul's most recent tactics and strategies, and warned against underestimating the powerful orc warlord's abilities. General Kurov had always been renowned for his judgment of men in battle, and he was deeply impressed by Yarrick's drive and intelligence. He requested that Yarrick take over the leadership of the military council for the duration of the crisis, and, to general relief, the Commissar agreed. 6 weeks after entering the Armageddon system, the vast orc armada went into battle with the Imperial space stations and weapon platforms in high orbit above the world. Those who had hoped that the powerful orbital defenses of Armageddon would keep the orcs at bay were soon proved to be hopelessly in error. The orbital battle raged for 3 full days and 2 terrible nights. But by the dawn of the 3rd day, the skies of Armageddon were filled with the trails of orc landing pods and the incandescent streaks of their attack craft carving runnels through the clouds. Hive Hades, still a ruin following the previous conflict, was the first to fall. In an act of vengeance, Gazgul chose not to fight again at Hades. Instead, the entire Hive city and its inhabitants were smashed asunder by the colossal impact of a giant asteroid dropped from the orcs' orbiting space hulks. This act of wanton destruction was a premonition of the monstrous bloodshed that was to come. As the fires of Hades' destruction lit the eastern horizon, the first orc drop legions clashed with Imperial defenders near Volcanus, Acheron, and Deathmire. Ground-based defense lasers and missile silos took a terrible toll on the orcs as they landed, but the hulking survivors regrouped and assaulted the defense with such ferocity that soon more and more of the greenskin horde was reaching the planet's surface unharmed. Feral orcs swept down from the Palidus Mountains and out of the world's equatorial jungles to join the growing numbers of their more technologically inclined brethren. Where the Imperial defenses proved too strong to be taken by frontal assault, huge mobs of orcs and their war machines were teleported directly into battle from the space hulks waiting above. As the ground defenses fell silent on the third day of the orc landings, Yarick ordered every remaining aircraft on Armageddon to be thrown into battle in a desperate attempt to destroy as much of Ghazghul's ground troops as possible before they reached the surface. The sudden yellow skies over volcanic Armageddon became interwoven with the twisting trails of thousands of orc fighter boomers and Imperial thunderbolts and furies as massive dogfights proceeded with maniacal fury. The Imperial aircraft had the advantage in that they could return to their armored air bases to refuel and rearm, whereas the orcs had to reserve enough fuel to climb back up to their starships and space hulks in orbit. Yet the orcs soon secured the ground bases, and the air battle turned against the brave Imperial pilots, as the sheer number of orc aircraft was brought fully to bear upon them. As the aerial battles reached their climax 5 days after the orc landings, Hive Acheron fell to the orcs without warning, captured by treachery from within. Reports spoke of the Hive City's power grid being sabotaged and the orcs boiling up from the secret access tunnels at the very heart of the great archaeology. The instigator of these terrible crimes was revealed to be none other than the infamous war criminal and former Armageddon planetary governor Hermann von Straub. He took over the conquered Hive City as its own new overlord, announcing that it was his divine right to rule over Armageddon. Orc brute squads stood ready to silence any dissenters who doubted von Straub's new right to rule. Shockingly, much of the old nobility in Acheron welcomed back von Straub as their long-lost prince, choosing to ignore the fact that he had thrown in his lot with some of the most violent Xenos known to the Imperium. At Hive Volcanus, on the same day that Acheron fell to betrayal, massed orc infantry surged over the 20 square miles of defenses atop Volcanus Mount, just beyond the Hive City's outer suburbs. 17 garrison regiments of Armageddon, 5 Hive militias were routed and the orcs captured many weapons and Imperial fortifications fully intact. Volcanus itself soon found itself besieged, surrounded by a ring of orcish power that relentless, pounded by captured Imperial macro cannons and barrage bombs. Outside Deathmire, the defense went better. The Titans of Legio Tempestor and Victorum, with their supporting regiments of the Mechanicus Cybernetic Skitari, virtually exterminated the Orcs' Blackfire tribe in a 3-day battle across the plain of Antrant. But the Orc landers fell from the skies like an endless storm, and the fighting spread across Armageddon like a wildfire, until every Hive city and factory complex was involved. In many places, orc attacks were beaten off by the bravery and ferocity of Imperial defenders. But again and again, the orcs regrouped and attacked once more, stretching the defenders to the limits of their endurance and beyond. As Yarick had predicted, Ghazghul's strategies proved effective. The orcs kept an iron grip on Armageddon's airspace. Orbital bombardments and fighter boomers pounded Imperial forces wherever they tried to form a coherent battle line, pinning them in place while further orc infantry landings were made to surround them. Where the orcs found themselves outnumbered, they fought in guerrilla tactics, striking at their human foes and then withdrawing into the world's harsh ash wastelands before retribution could arrive. Ghazghul had learned the lessons of Saigon 17 very well and deliberately prepared so that the fighting was scattered and chaotic, precisely the conditions in which orc warbands thrived, and Imperial regiments were denied the support and coordination that humans depended upon to defend effectively. The only Imperial force of which constantly defended the orcs were the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, defeated the orcs. The Space Marines scoured the hinterlands of Armageddon on search and destroy missions to eliminate concentrations of the savage greenskins at every opportunity. Total war. Never before has the Orc menace been greater. Ghazghul has achieved what we thought impossible. He has united hundreds of warbands with but a single goal: the total and utter destruction of humanity in the Armageddon sector. Arrayed against this barbaric horde is the greatest force of arms the Imperium has mustered since the time of Lord Solar Macarius. The fate of hundreds of worlds will be decided on the blood-soaked ash dunes of Armageddon, and we cannot afford to fail. Commissar Yarrick. As the battles raged furiously on Armageddon's surface, Ghazghul unleashed another of his surprises. Dozens of the great Orc rooks encountered by Admiral Perrault's starships began to descend from orbit. Slowed by powerful gravitic force fields, retro boosters, and modified Orc tractor cannons, the Orc rooks made landings in the verdant equatorial jungles and across Armageddon Prime and Secundus. Many were lost to the ground fire or Orky accidents, but each one that survived became a new bastion for the Orcs, a rallying point and a new citadel. As well as their huge guns and missile batteries, the Rooks contained giant teleport arrays created by Orchimendes that were similar to those Ghazghul has used during the Piscina campaign. These were employed to teleport down Orc reinforcements from their orbiting fleet, including Gargants and heavy artillery. In a seemingly endless stream of greenskins, Commissar Yarrick personally led assaults by Imperial Guard's Cadian stormtroopers, supported by the Titans of Legio Metallica and Legio Ignatum, which destroyed several of the Orc fortresses. But bloody battles around many of the others consumed whole regiments in only hours. For the rest of the war, the Space Marines bore the brunt of eliminating the Orc fortresses where they could, with the Salamanders chapter winning particular honor for their success against the Rooks along the Hemlock River. Mysteriously, the Orcs also made landings in the Fire Waste and the Deadlands to the north and south of the main settled continent of Armageddon. Even Yarrick was surprised, as these grim lands had always been believed to be uninhabitable and without value. Their value to the Orc war bosses became apparent when weeks later, hundreds of tanker-sized Orc submersible designed by Orchimedes rose from the polluted waters and made landings on Hive Tempestora and Hell's Reach. The surprise was total, and Tempestora fell within days, and the dockyards of Hell's Reach were soon in greenskin hands. Only a bitter defiance by Hive Hell's Reach Ganger militia, with supporting companies of Imperial Guard stormtroopers and Space Marines that had been rushed to the region, prevented the Orcs from overrunning the Hive city during what became known as the Battle of Hell's Reach. It was at Hive Hell's Reach that the Black Templar's chaplain Grimaldus led the defense of the Temple of the Emperor Ascended, which had stood against Armageddon's colonization. 14 days after the initial Orc landings on the planet, the first major confrontation between Orc and Imperial war engines occurred. A 10-day battle raged over the Diabolus factory complex as the gargant mobs of Warlord Buzuruk and Warlord Scarfang clashed with the Titans of Legio Crucius. 6 Titans and 8 Gargants were utterly destroyed in the fighting, and others needed many months of repair before they were ready to enter combat again. The Diabolus complex was wrecked by the battle. Its great foundries and machine shops blasted apart or crushed underfoot by the gigantic robotic war machines. In the aftermath of the battle, Orc speed codes swiftly encircled Hive Infernos, cutting it off from all external aid. Mechanized Imperial counterattacks into the ash waste met with initial success, but when an entire Imperial Guard regiment of Salvar Chemo Dogs was surrounded and wiped out by the Speed Freaks, further attempts by Imperial defenders on Infernus to break out from Orc encirclement were abandoned. As the defenders pondered how to lift the Greenskin siege, reports came in of a vast Orc horde rounding the Palidus mountains from the northeast. Soon the horde was visible from the Hive spires. a great sea of greenskin warriors which seemed to fill the empty expanses of the ash wastes to overflowing. Towering orc gargants strode through the tide like dreadnoughts rolling on a sea of green doom. The war chants of the orcs could be heard from over 20 miles away, the ground shaking with the horde's progress. Even worse, the sea of war banners swaying over the orcs bore the personal glyph of Ghazghul himself. As the skies darkened beneath the shadows of orc spacehawks high above the hive city, and the first orbital bombardments began, the citizens of Infernus knew that doom was upon them. They tried to take inspiration from the legends of Commissary Yarrick during the previous orc invasion, and how he had made the greenskins pay for every inch of ground they took at Hive Hades. Not all were courageous enough to face their fates, and thousands fled into the ash wastes to be killed or captured as slaves by speed cults, which encircled the Hive city like buzzards. The Adeptus Arbites arbiters, within the city soon moved to secure the Hive, turning back or outright executing any who failed their duty to the Emperor. As Ghazghul's orc army came within the range of the city, the great siege guns that had survived the orbital bombardment pounded them, lobbing 1,000-pound shells into masses of greenskins, until return fire from the orbiting spacehawks smashed them apart. In the brief lull that followed, Ghazghul delivered to the defenders of Infernus a messenger. It was Colonel Grotar of the Chemdogs, horribly mutilated and missing both his eyes and hands. The message the blind and crippled colonel bore was a simple one that would be heard many times in the months to come across Armageddon as the war only escalated. Surrender or die. Black Templars Armageddon Crusade. High Marshal, says in parentheses Chapter Master, but High Marshal Helbridge of the Black Templars chapter and 3 full crusades of his Space Marines answered the plea for aid from the besieged world of Armageddon when the orc warlord Ghazghul Mag Uruktraka returned at the head of the largest orc war seen in living memory. The surrounding star systems and worlds fell quickly to the swarm of orcs, despite valiant attempts by Battlefleet Armageddon to stop the invasion. The war was simply too massive to halt. The Black Templars fought bloody campaigns throughout the ash wastelands of Armageddon, but it was in space that their greatest contribution was made to the defense of the world. 3 Black Templar crusades assembled at a chapter keep on the world of Fergax and set course for Segmentum Solar. Upon arriving at the war-torn world of Armageddon, Helbridge's experience of commanding great fleets made him a natural leader for the assembled Adeptus Astartes starships, while Black Templar Marshal Ricard and Omric took their crusade to the surface of Armageddon. The war in space was bitterly fought, with Helbridge leading many storming actions aboard orc spacehawks. The Imperial Navy fleet under the command of Admiral Parole began to whittle down the massive fleet of orc starships and spacehawks, and the reduction of orc ground reinforcements eventually began to tell on the Greenskins' war effort. By the commencement of the Season of Fire, where the surface of Armageddon became hostile to all life because of extreme volcanism, the fighting between orcs and humans had boiled down to an uneasy stalemate. Fall of a champion. The Black Templars' success in blunting the orc invasion was shattered when Helbridge's crusade returned to the Spacehawk Malevolent Dread. Earlier in the orbit engagement, this hulk had been heavily bombarded by the Black Templars' battle barge, Light of Purity, and damaged by charges planted by Black Templars' boarding parties. Finally, Helbridge decided to put an end to the hulk once more, and for all, and gathered his crusade and all of his sworn brethren Terminators to launch a massive boarding assault. An assault of this kind had never before been attempted on such a scale, but Helbridge was determined to put an end to the gargantuan spaceborne monstrosity. The first stage of the assault was a teleport attack led by the Black Templars' Terminators. The Terminators established the perimeter to allow the rest of the Templars' forces to board the Spacehawk. The Orc response was immediate, and the Terminators came under full heavy assault. Casualties mounted, but Hellbridge was determined to make room for the reinforcements. Thunderhawks and boarding torpedoes made it to the Hulk and joined the fighting at the perimeter. The Terminators held the Orcs at bay, but it was a tenuous achievement at best. The second phase of the mission began as the Crusade organized into strike teams to lay the heavy thermal charges that would tear the malevolent Dread in two. Hellbridge himself would lead the most important team, despite having been wounded several times already. Hellbridge was determined to plant the charges that would initiate the chain reaction and destroy the Hulk once and for all. Along with his command squads and the Templars' Emperor's champion, Vosper, Hellbridge pushed deeper into the Hulk. The Terminators had held the Orcs at bay during the first phases of the battle, and during the second phase they led the advance, forming the spearhead of the Templars' forces as they fought their way through the twisting corridors of the Hulk. Once they abandoned their relatively secure firing lanes, however, casualties began to rise yet again. But with the support of an entire crusade, the Terminators managed to press through the Orc defenses. As more and more strike teams broke off to complete their individual objectives, the Templars' forces became ever more vulnerable to sudden ambush and attacks. It was as the Templars broke into a cavernous gap between two of the ill-fitting starships that made up the Hulk that the Orcs launched their largest assault yet. Over 1,000 of the greenskin monstrosities threw themselves into the bolter fire laid down by the Templars, heedless of their own losses. An audible crack sounded as the Orcs smashed into the Templars' line. Their advance lost, the Templars nevertheless managed to hold the line. Vosper and Hellbridge led the counterattack, skiting into the Orcs with unmatched skill, building a pile of Orc dead at their feet. Slowly, the tide of battle turned as the Templars reformed behind their champions to cut through the Orc horde. As the two mighty warriors slashed their way through the Orcs, they came upon the largest of the foul creatures, the Space Hulk War Boss, who tore through the swirling melee, cutting down the warrior Battle Brothers wherever he went. Filled with righteous fury, the Emperor's champion Vosper called the massive Orc to account and faced the creature in one-on-one combat. Each Templar whispered a prayer to the Emperor as Vosper and the Orc boss crossed blades, praying for their champion who was the very embodiment of all their chapter held dear. Vosper attacked the Orc warlord with huge two-handed sweeps as the chapter's famed black sword, driving the creature back step by step and slowly gaining the upper hand. But as the war boss reeled back from a powerful overhead blow, it became enraged and recovered with inhuman speed, driving Vosper back. And though the Emperor's champion met every blow of the Orc's sword, he could not stop the creature from barreling into him. Knocked off balance, Vosper could not stand aside as the war boss split his skull in two. Their champion's fall was the turning point of the battle. Despite High Marshal Hellbridge's best efforts, the Templars faltered and the Orcs redoubled their efforts. The High Marshal was forced to the ground, swamped by dozens of greenskins. His command squad pulled him clear, but an Orc chopper was buried in his chest armor. As the Templars fell back, many were brutally cut down, and the casualties for the chapter went from bad to horrendous. Many groups of Templars found themselves cut off as the teleporter rays of the Light of Purity overloaded with the strain of teleporting units back on board. Without an effective defensive perimeter, there was nothing the Crusade could do to rescue the stranded squads, leaving them to do nothing but try to sell their lives as dearly as possible. By the time the Light of Purity pulled away from the Space Hulk, almost half of Hellbridge's crusade had been lost, and Hellbridge himself had been critically injured. Only his enhanced body keeping him from joining the Emperor. Finally, with Armageddon's season of fire upon the combatants, the fighting on the planet's surface finally stalled as the Orcs found it difficult to advance in the face of the world's rampant volcanism. The Space Hulk, believed to be the flagship of Ghazghul Traka, the perversion of pain, departed Armageddon's orbit along with the bulk of the remaining spaceborne Orc forces, swearing a mighty oath to hunt down and slay Ghazghul before he could threatened the Imperium again. High Marshal Helbridge took his remaining Crusade forces and pursued the Greenskins, but the Black Templars' fleet did not leave alone. The hero of Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick, petitioned High Marshal Helbridge to allow him to accompany the Black Templars alongside a hand-picked force of elite Imperial Guardsmen, and as a sign of the esteem in which Helbridge held Yarrick, the High Marshal granted his request. Chaplain Grimaldus, Heroes of Hell's Reach. Yes, heroes, plural. If you know the story, you know the story. When the Third Black Crusade on Armageddon was led by Chaplain Grimaldus, who had just recently been raised to the position of Reclusiarch after the death of his mentor Mordred, under the direction of the High Marshal, he led over 100 of his battle brothers into some of the most horrific battles to take place on Armageddon. After a score of successful campaigns, Grimaldus gathered his forces and charged towards the Hive Hell's Reach, which was besieged at the time by thousands of orcs who had swarmed up from the icy Deadlands in the south, using Orchimendes' submersibles, initiating the terrible Battle of Hell's Reach. The Black Templars stood their ground at the colossal building known as the Temple of the Emperor Ascended, a vast basilica dedicated to the imperial cult that had stood since the earliest days of Armageddon's colonization. The orcs attacked with devastating force, but Chaplain Grimaldus and his Astartes held out for almost 2 months. The orcs finally penetrated the Space Marines' defenses and stormed the temple, destroying irreplaceable relics, infuriating the Templars even more. Many of the Hive militants and Imperial Guardsmen supporting the Space Marines turned to flee, but were rallied by the sound of Chaplain Grimaldus' booming voice echoing through the temple. "I have dug my grave in this place, and I will either triumph or I will die." The battle degenerated into bloody melee in the heart of the building, ending only when the entire edifice began to crumble. Eventually collapsing around the combatants, all were feared lost until a day later, when Chaplain Grimaldus crawled from the ruins, bearing the last relic of the temple, and vowing that all would remember the lives that had been lost in the defense of Armageddon. The Black Templar apothecaries, who examined him later, were amazed that Grimaldus had survived, much less found the strength to climb from the ruins. When the war finally ended, the citizens of Hell's Reach honored him with the title of Hero of Hell's Reach. Celestial Lions Crusade on Armageddon. If you know, you know. The Celestial Lions are a successor chapter raised from the genestock of the Imperial Fist's Primarch Rogol Dorn. They were created during the unnamed founding during the later years of the 38th millennium. During the next 4 millennia, the Lions proved to be a resolute chapter and true scions of Dorn, fiercely defending the realms of man from the enemies of the Emperor. But the Lions' fierce pride and moral principles that have always governed their chapter's thoughts and deeds may have contributed to their own destruction. Events that set in motion over 5 solar decades earlier during a routine assault on the world of Katkar in 948 proved to be the chapter's undoing in the wake of the events that unfolded during the Third War of Armageddon. The Mannheim Gap. Grimaldus. They lied to us about the Mannheim Gap. They sent us there to die. You know of whom I speak. We cannot outrun the echoes of Qatar. We pay the price now for our virtue in the past. The Celestial Lions will never leave this world. A handful of us remain, but we know the truth. We died at the Mannheim Gap. We died the day the sun rose over the scrap iron bodies of alien gods. Message for Black Templars Reclusiarch. Merrick Grimaldus from Celestial Lions Death Speaker Julkara. The Mannheim Gap on Armageddon was a canyon running through the mountainous north of High Volcanus. It was a rent in Armageddon's priceless earth, torn open by the slow, active dance of the world's tectonics. Any who dwelled there for far more than a handful of solar weeks knew that Armageddon was not a world that slept easy, whether due to greenskins, dust storms, or yet another war. The Celestial Lions were told the canyon had to be assaulted, for it was the nest of a mechanical heresy where the aliens were constructing their scrap iron god machines or gargants. High Volcano's forces had to strike before the alien gargants became active, or the tide would forever turn against the city's defenders. The Astra Militarum could not be trusted to deal such a surgical strike, nor could the Hive City organize a mass withdrawal and redeployment of its deeply entrenched guard elements to make it a plausible option. The task fell to the Lions. Primitive void shielding protected the site from orbital bombardment. The Lions had to strike over land without drop pods, marching into the ravine alongside their tanks, attacking in battalion regiments like some echo of the Horus Heresy and the millennia of crude warfare before it. The Lions recontorted, of course. Whatever. They accepted, of course. They scoured and watched, deeming Imperial intelligence reliable. None of the alien god walkers were infused with life, but time was not on their side. Every solar hour they spent behind their fortress's walls was another solar hour that brought the Gargan machines closer to awakening. 500 Celestial Lion Astartes attacked. The last half of the chapter went to war, knowing that the enemy numbers were beyond the capabilities of the Imperial Guard to confront. They chose to bring overwhelming force and to strike fast and hard, seeking to counter their crippling inability to strike from the skies. 500 Space Marines were involved, and some chapters had taken whole worlds with a quarter of that number. The Lion Commanders were right to commit their full fury. Any chapter master would have done the same. There was no possible way the enemy could have known such a force was coming to destroy them, and there was simply no way to prepare for an assault by 500 Space Marine warriors. Strike with ferocity and destroy the enemy, and then fall back before getting entrenched in a full-scale battle. It should have worked. In truth, the Gargants were not sleeping. They were simply waiting. Despite this setback, if that was all they had to deal with, the Lions might have fought their way clear without being slaughtered. They might have even won, despite dying to the last man. The Lions' gold battle tanks raged skywards, streams of las cannon fire-bursting thin shields and scoring holes in the hulls of the towering enemy war machines. War leaders shouted orders, in control of their warriors even in the heat of battle, establishing where to strike, where to push through the Orc lines, where to move in defense of tank battalions threatened by enemy infantry. Even when the Gargants awoke, the last half of a noble chapter still fought to win. They would purge the canyon at the cost of their own lives. Dor himself would have stood with them that day. But the tide truly turned. The enemy ambush unfolded further as greenskins spiled from the earth, pouring in hordes from warrens within the canyon sides and the rocky ground. There were thousands of them, roaring beneath fanged war banners and standards made from crucified celestial lions taken in other battles. This fresh army surged into the ravine, filling it like sand in an hourglass, blocking all hope of withdrawal and eliminating any chance of victory. Somehow, the Orcs knew that the Lions were coming. There could be no other reason to bury whole war clans under the rock, waiting for such an assault. Their overlord was a beast clad in scrapwork armor, the biggest greenskin the Lions had ever seen. He ate the dead, his own and the Lions. War leader Vulrak buried the war sword Jehara in the beast's belly and carved 3 meters of stinking alien guts free. It did nothing. The Lions fought back as they fell, but they knew they were betrayed. A traitor somewhere had fed word to the enemy, and the Orcs made the most of their ambush. But soon the extent of the treachery was revealed. A sniper fire, deadly accurate, rained down from the canyon walls. Not the solid shell rattle of greenskin projectile throwers, for the Lions knew how the Orcs fought. This was viciously precise laser weaponry, knifing through their officers' helms from above. Death speakers, War leaders, spirit walkers, even pride leaders, cut down with fire too precise, too clinical, to be that of the greenskin enemy. It took the lions 4 solar hours to fight free. They carved their way back the way they came, abandoning a sea of dead tanks, slain battle brothers, and butchered green enemy bodies. The gene seed of half the chapter lay rotting at the bottom of that canyon, unharvested by the lions' life binders, and defiled by the thousands of foes they left alive. The lions had fled from the field, and the most valiant battle the celestial lions ever fought was that retreat. Never had they faced such odds, and the last of them cut their way free, pulling their brothers from the storm of blades, and fell back to their fortress with the enemy at their heels. The Xenos flooded their forward bases before most of their survivors had even arrived. The Celestial Lions had to fight just to escape their own failing fortress. Even then, for every gunship that raced free, another 2 were shot down in flames. The survivors of the Celestial Lions returned to High Volcanus. Only 3 officers were left at dusk of that day. 3 officers above the rank of Pride Leader. Death Speaker Julkhara, who called to recluse the Archmeric Grimaldus of the Black Templar's brother. War Leader Vacuum, the last surviving captain of the chapter. And Lifebinder Keituch, the Lion's only living apothecary. The chapter's future rested on his skills. But the final insult was yet to play out. The last gasp in this drama of shame and treachery occurred later, the same terrible evening. The Celestial Lion's territory inside the city was a cold foundry, nearly lightless, with the perimeter of Rockcrete patrolled by the remaining warriors. Lifebinder Keituch did not survive the first night after the terrible defeat. The lions found him at dawn, slouched against their last land raider, shot through the islands. The gene seed he had carried was gone, and he would harvest no more. The depths of the Celestial Lion's plight on Armageddon were dire indeed. They had lost their fleet, their armory, their officers, and almost all hope of rebuilding their chapter. They couldn't even cling to pride after the shame of defeat. All that remained to them was the truth. The lions vowed to survive long enough to speak it. The Imperium needed to know what had happened to them on Armageddon, where they had been betrayed by others who claimed to serve the Emperor. The dark truth. The remaining Celestial Lions then determined to die on Armageddon alongside their brothers, as was right and honorable if the chapter could never be revived. Death Speaker Julkhara reached out to Reclusiar Grimaldus, a fellow son of Dorn, to know the truth behind their coming last stand and ensure those that shared their Primarch's blood never spoke ill of the Celestial Lion's fall. Julkhara sent a lone Storm Eagle from High Volcanus to seek help from the hero of Hell's Reach, the zealous chaplain Grimaldus, who had recently held the besieged Hive Hell's Reach against thousands of orcs. Convalescing for several solar weeks after being buried alive in the rubble of the collapsed temple of the Emperor Ascended, Grimaldus soon received word of the discovery of a crashed Storm Eagle. The downed Celestial Lion gunship had fallen victim to the fearful winds and violent storms that wrecked Armageddon skies, heralding the infamous season of fire. Acquiring a Valkyr from the 101st Armageddon Steel Legion Regiment, Grimaldus and his subordinate chaplain initiate, Cineric, departed the safety of the Hive City to investigate the crash site despite the horrendous weather conditions. The air was severe enough to scald unprotected flesh, and while the Astartes power armors offered a shield against the elements, it wouldn't protect them for long. Grimaldus was unable to determine the chapter origins of the Storm Eagle from its outward appearance, as whatever colors he had bore into battle were long gone, stolen by the storm. Its symbols of allegiance were similarly eroded by ash and dirt in the turbulent wind. Smashing his way through the ship's bulkhead with his Crozius maul, Grimaldus and Cyneric found the body of a lone space marine pilot, clad in burnished gold, lying in an ungainly repose where the deck met the weapon-racked walls. The Reclusiarch recognized the chapter's color, the Celestial Lions. But the discovery left more questions than answers. Grimaldus couldn't understand what this gunship was doing all the way out in this remote location, so far from High Volcanus, nearly half a world away from its point of origin. Removing the dead Space Marine's Auser helmet, the faint signs of darkening decay and evidence clearly indicated that he had been several days dead. Upon further inspection, Grimaldus discovered a hololithic image fire the size of a human fist maglocked to the dead warrior's belt. Once free and activated, it gave rise to a flickering blue image, the ghost of another warrior in another city, wearing the heraldry of the Celestial Lions, and carrying a skull-faced helmet beneath one arm. Grimaldus recognized the fellow chaplain as Death Speaker Julkhara, whose wavering voice brought grim tidings. Grimaldus, they lied to us about the Mannheim Gap. They sent us here to die. Grimaldus and Cyneric departed the crash site and made their way to the protective walls of Hive Hellsreach. Once safely inside, the Reclusiarch sent a secure Vox message to the Eternal Crusade, the flagship of the Black Templars' High Marshal, Helbrecht. When he contacted the mighty vessel, he relayed his orders to a chapter serf, instructing him to complete 4 tasks. First, he was to make contact with every vessel of the Celestial Lions chapter still in orbit, so that he could have a full accounting of their war fleet. Second, they were to contact whatever command structure remained in place at High Volcanus, and to acquire a detailed report of every Adeptus Astartes casualty in that region since the war's commence. Third, he and Cyneric needed a gunship to return to the Eternal Crusader. If the coming storm hit before arrangements could be made, they would risk teleportation. For the 4th and final order, the Eternal Crusader was to make contact with the ranking officer of the Celestial Lions garrisoned at High Volcanus. He warned that the transmission would most assuredly be monitored, no matter what encryption processes were run. The following message was to be delivered. Grimaldus knew he had to be careful how he worded his message. It was only 6 words. No pity, no remorse, no fear. Back aboard the Eternal Crusader, Reclusiarch Grimaldus met with High Marshal Helbrecht, producing for him the handheld holo-recorder which delayed the dire message from the Celestial Lions Death Speaker. The High Marshal inquired as to what the Reclusiarch hoped to accomplish. Grimaldus sought to establish contact with the Celestial Lions, to take stock of their losses, and if possible, destroy those who betrayed them. But the High Marshal knew in his heart that this would be impossible no matter how much it appealed to him. The High Marshal warned Grimaldus that he risked dragging the chapter into direct conflict with the Inquisition. The High Marshal sympathized with Grimaldus' cause, for injustice must be stopped and impurity must be purged. But the Eternal Crusader was set sail in 3 solar days in order to pursue the fleeing Gazgul Mag Uruktraka, the warlord who held his massive war in the invasion of Armageddon. The Reclusiarch requested to be left behind. The High Marshal was surprised by Grimaldus' request. He was caught between the purity of war against external enemies and the just war against an internal foe. Grimaldus would fight both, if he could. The Orc warlord's death, however, took priority over all else. The arch-warlord responsible for Armageddon could not be allowed to flee from their grasp, for retribution called as loud as justice. But Helbrecht could not overlook that the Celestial Lions' devastating losses were the principal reason he believed his Reclusiarch's concerns were valid. Justice called to them. At the very least, the Black Templars wished to learn the truth of the matter. He ordered Grimaldus to go to High Volcanus to learn the truth of what happened. If the Celestial Lions were destined to die, the High Marshal wished to hear the truth of their tale before it was too late. The Last Officer. Anyone who trusts an agent of the Inquisition has earned the right to be named naive, Cyrenaic. There is a reason the Adeptus Astartes stand apart from the Imperium. Autonomous, loyal to the Empire's ideal, but rarely its function. The Lion's most grievous error was forgetting that. Black Templar's Reclusiarch Merrick Grimaldus, remarking on the Celestial Lion's betrayal to his chaplain initiate, Cyneric. Soon, Grimaldus and his charge made their way to Armageddon Prime, where High Volcanus was still besieged by the enemies, and the winds were more often free of the burning sand and ash that so blighted the other side of the world. The Celestial Lion's fire base was located atop a natural rise in the landscape, supremely defensible, with great battlements and sacred statuary of fallen imperial heroes staring down at any who would dare bring the fight to those dark walls. The whole site was already in ruin. The pair of Black Templars were honored for their presence by the remaining lions. Grimaldus noticed right away that several of the Celestial Lions were plundering their own fire-based supplies, loading up their surviving Thunderhawks with brutal efficiency. The warriors themselves kept at least one hand free to reach for a bolter at a moment's notice. A lone Space Marine came forward, bearing the black helmet of a Pride leader. He knelt before the Reclusiarch and removed his dark helmet. Grimaldus was greeted by the sight of a face that was warm, a rich brown complexion of a human born to equatorial climes. Though he had never been to the Lion's homeworld of Elysium 9, he had met many of its dark-skinned sons. They were a culture of hunters, proud from birth to death, true scions of Dorne. Grimaldus did not recognize the warrior, who introduced himself as Pride Leader Ekin Dubaku. Pride Leader was the Lion's term for a squad sergeant. This did not bode well. Dubaku was now the senior surviving Lion who led those that remained. The veteran Marine explained that there were 96 Lions still drawing breath upon Armageddon, and that he inherited command from war leader Vakembe, he of the speaker that hunts hearts, who had been slain 18 solar days earlier. Grimaldus knew Vakembe, a stalwart Space Marine officer and a deadly swordsman. The Reclusiarch inquired as to the whereabouts of Death Speaker Julkhara. The Pride leader replied that he had been slain by the Kine, a Celestial Lion term for cattle or beasts. The Greenskins. Nearly 24 solar days passed. Now the surviving Lions were looting what was left of their supplies at their forward base. They had little choice since it was overrun. Their fallback stronghold was within High Volcanus itself, but they risked raids in this forward area every 3 solar days. Ammunition was low. Production and resupply from their fleet had dropped to almost nothing. Grimaldus wondered why the Celestial Lions had not requested aid from the other chapters present on Armageddon, but understood that Dorne's blood ran thick in the veins of his descendants. It was difficult to lay such pride aside, even in the face of devastation. Especially then, for that was when a warrior was truly tested. There was no other time more fit for proving that a man was strong enough to stand alone. Dubaku explained that they had swallowed their pride long enough to request aid from the Flesh Terrors and the Black Templars. But the former were as depleted as they were, and the latter were preparing to take the fight out to the stars in pursuit of the fleeing Orc warlord. The Lions felt they had no right to beg for scraps while being left behind, so they existed by plundering their fallen fortress and looting their own dead. This confirmed for Grimaldus that Julkhara's summons had been a personal one. It had cost his pride dearly to send it. The Reclusiarch was struck by one thing above all else. The Celestial Lions were effectively dead. While 100 yet remained, the chapter operated now without a single voice from their chapter's high command, and their ranking veteran officer was a squad sergeant. Grimaldus ordered the Lions to finish loading their gunships. Then he wanted Dubaku to tell him everything that had happened to the chapter since they made planetfall. It remained to be seen just what Julkhara expected of the Black Templars. or what Grimaldus could actually achieve for the Lions. It already felt less like he had been summoned to save the Lions, and more like he had been called to hold vigil, watching over the chapter as it died. The Pride leader's tale was grim. The Reclusiarch's blood ran cold as Dubaku revealed each new betrayal that had occurred. Grimaldus quickly realized that the surviving Lions meant to die on this world, the Pride leader confirming this was true. The Lions intended to die alongside their brothers, as it should be. This speaker Jukhara wished for Grimaldus to know the truth behind their coming last stand, and ensure that those who shared the Primarch's blood never spoke ill of their sacrifice. Cyneric argued that the Celestial Lions should return to Elysium 9, to endure the shame if they must, as the Crimson Fist endured their shame after the Battle of Rin's world. They had rebuilt their chapter. The galaxy must not lose the Celestial Lions forever. But the remaining Lions scoffed at this suggestion. Their chapter had been savaged beyond resurrection. Men, material, knowledge, all of it was gone. They had nothing to hand down to any generation that would follow them. The remaining Lions refused to flee like cowards. But it was not cowardice Cyrenic advocated. It was survival. Survival to preserve precious blood, and to rise again to fight another day. Grimaldus agreed with both opposing viewpoints, for a glorious last stand was no more or less respectable than preserving the infinite value of a Space Marine chapter. But Grimaldus wondered if Cyrenic would advocate shame if he were the one facing the prospect of so glorious a last stand. Easier to speak of shame than endure it. And yet Grimaldus was just as determined that the chapter had to survive. The remaining Lions explained to Grimaldus that the Inquisition wanted to silence them. But the Reclusiarch assured them that this was not the case. They were using the Celestial Lions to make an example. The Lions were in fact the most recent casualty in the Inquisition's campaign to rein in the political autonomy of the Adeptus Astartes. The Inquisition tolerated no attacks on its sovereign rights. The Lions had challenged them, and now all would bear the witness to the price of their chapter's rebellion. The sabotages, the conflicting orders, the ambushes, all would lead to the destruction of a Space Marine chapter. Millions of Imperial citizens would hear of how the Celestial Lions were killed on Armageddon. A mere handful would know the truth behind their deaths, and each of those would be Adeptus Astartes officers who would tread with much more caution when they dealt with the Inquisition in the future. The lesson would be learned, just as Inquisitor Apolline's cronies wished. Digesting this information, Pride Leader Dubaku explained to the Reclusiarch that his chapter would make for the Mannheim Gap, and that, though many of the Gargants were gone, it was still a well-defended Orc stronghold. It remained a cancer in High Volcanus' territory, and it must fall. This seemed idealistic at best to Grimaldus. He informed the Lions that in fact he would not fall, not to a handful of Lions, no matter how noble and proud they were. Dubaku countered that they would die trying, for this was where the Celestial Lions had chosen to die. It had to be there, for then their bones would lie alongside their brothers. Grimaldus inquired if the Lions would fight alone, to which Debaku replied that they would. Volcanus could not spare its Astra Militarum regiments. Even with Mannheim emptied of Gargants in the solar week since the massacre, a fact they could not be certain was true, it was still a difficult target, rich with enemy presence. 5 of the Lions' battle companies had failed to take it. A few thousand guardsmen would be nothing more than spitting in the wind. The Lions could not trust any of the guardsmen in any case, for the Inquisition's talons were everywhere. After hearing their tale of woe, Grimaldus decided that Cyrenic had been right. The Lions' death would be a disservice to the Imperium, no matter the greatness of their glorious last stand, no matter the heroism of individual warriors as they spent their life's blood. The Lions argued that this was how they wanted it to end, to finish their legacy in fire, not in centuries of painstaking laboratory work to preserve their bloodline. They wanted to die as warriors. Indeed they would, thought Grimaldus. 100 warriors. dying in glory, and denying the possibility of thousands of warriors who might be needed in a darker future. It was Dorn's way to fight on no matter the odds. Death against overwhelming numbers was no shame to any warrior born of the Imperial Fist gene seed. Yet those were lessons first taught 10,000 Terran years ago, when the Imperium was so much stronger. The last centuries of the current Dark Millennium had all but bled mankind's empire dry. Yet the Ecclesiarch still admired Dubaku's... Wait, is it Debaku at some point, right? It's the wiki. Yet the Ecclesiarch still admired Dubaku for his hunger to taste a glorious death, even if it was a last charge few would remember. Dubaku informed the Ecclesiarch that they would not delay the inevitable, and were prepared to make their last stand almost immediately. His chapter would gather their resources the next day at their forward base, and make one last scouting run for supplies and survivors. The Lions would then charge to their final war at dawn the day after. The Pride leader made one last request of the stern chaplain. He requested that Grimaldus grant final unction to the surviving Celestial Lion warriors. The Black Templar had only agreed to speak of the Lion's death, and that he understood how it had happened and why they had chosen to act as they did. But now they wished for him to also bless their damnation. The Lions had no surviving Death Speaker, so they wanted Grimaldus to bless the warriors of another chapter, sharing the Black Templar's sacred rituals, and vowing before the Emperor and Rogal Dorn that their death would be a noble testament to the Imperial Fist's bloodline. Grimaldus looked upon the surviving Celestial Lions, standing amongst them during their desperate, respectful silence. Grimaldus felt he had no choice, could not grant his blessing to the suicide of the chapter, and refused to perform the requested rite upon the Lions. Choices. Grimaldus and his charge then departed the Celestial Lions forward base and made for the Eternal Crusader. He went there to put an audacious plan into motion. The chaplain knew he could not return to Hive Hellsreach, for the Season of Fire played its tempestuous game around the city, harsh enough to kill sky traffic but not quite violent enough to interfere with Vox signals. Utilizing the flagship's powerful communication array, he was able to amplify his transmitter signal to send a message through. Making contact with the Imperial forces on the ground, he relayed a series of orders to one of the Astra Militarum officers present there. It took several more hours to coordinate Hellsreach defense from high orbit. Grimaldus knew a great many guards officers were going to Vox skyward for confirmation in the hours to come. Time passed as Grimaldus spoke with 81 Astra Militarum officers and 11 naval captains. As his clearance was Rubicon grade, no one dared to question his orders. Cyrenik questioned the senior chaplain's motives and wondered if he hadn't exceeded his authority. But Grimaldus argued that the Lion's survival would be for the best, and he was depleting Hive Hellsreach defenses to march alongside the Lions back into the Mannheim Gap. The Ecclesiarch explained that the city was vastly over-defended now, with entire battalions sitting idle and awaiting redeployment. It was an irritating truth, with that they had such a problem when the real war was being fought. The soldiers in Hell's Reach were actually bored. They did not do well with tedium, especially when left alone with nothing to do and no one to shoot. Cyrenik felt Grimaldus was playing on the people's regard for him. The hero of Hell's Reach called him to war. Of course they would follow, but he was sure it was their war. The Ecclesiarch argued that it was their world, and it was the only chance the Celestial Lions had if they were to survive. The Lions' unseen enemies might well allow them to die in the glory they deserved, but their death served nothing but to ease the soreness of a wounded pride. The Celestial Lions must not die on Armageddon, and without help. The chapter was doomed. Everything depended on just how fast Grimaldus' forces at Hell's Reach could break out from the storm and redeploy halfway across the world. Second Mannheim Siege. I am remaining on the war world. Someone must fight alongside the Lions. saving them from futile glory and the worst excesses of their otherwise pure blood. The lions have no chaplain remaining, and they are our cousins. Honor and brotherhood demand this of me. The lions cannot call upon the resources of their hive city, but they will not fight alone. Let Volcanus hide behind its walls. Hell's Reach is going to war. Excerpt from a private message written by Black Templar Recrusiarch Grimaldus to High Marshal Helbrecht. Arranging for an Imperial Navy shuttle, both Grimaldus and Cyrenaic deployed to the surface of Armageddon. Dawn was less than a solar hour away as they broke clouds cover above the Celestial Lion's ruined fortress stronghold. Grimaldus wondered if the Celestial Lions would have already left their fallen fortress by the time they arrived, marching towards their last stand. Besides the remaining 4, dust-blasted and pain-stripped Thunderhawks possessed by the Celestial Lions resting upon the rooftops platform, dozens of inelegant, blocky troop landers had joined them there. Struggling to locate an unmarked, untaken patch of ground, Grimaldus ordered the shuttle to break off his descent, as both he and Cyrenaic jumped from the ship's rear bay. The pair of Black Templars descended from the sky to the ground by utilizing their jump packs. Pride leader Dubaku was taken aback by the return of the Black Templars. Grimaldus replied that he thought that the Lions might appreciate the extra bodies. The Ecclesiarch was greeted by General Kirvanov of the Armageddon Steel Legion, the acting commander of the Imperial Military Force at Hell's Reach. Within the solar hour, a war council was called, ordained before a battalion of reaving tanks. The plan was simple. They would march into the Mannheim Gap, and they would destroy anything that moved or breathed. Dubaku stood with Grimaldus at the heart of the impromptu conclave, his anger a palpable thing. He directed his ire at the Ecclesiarch, who he felt had overstepped his authority. The Pride leader did not appreciate these interlopers, who threatened to interfere with their personal vendetta and their glorious last stand. He argued with Grimaldus that this was the Celestial Lion's fight and no one else's. Dubaku warned Grimaldus that when the time came, when they confronted the Orc warlord responsible for so many of his battle brothers' deaths, it would be the lion's blade that killed the creature. Grimaldus vowed grimly that it would be so. And so the forces gathered from Hell's Reach marched in long, armored columns towards the Mannheim Gap. Every hope they possessed that Mannheim would be near devoid of Orc Titans was crushed before the first Steel Legion soldier had set foot on the loose rock slopes leading down into the canyon. The enemy was present in grotesque force. Gray sockets in the ringing and stanokins along the canyon walls marked the absence of several gargants, but many more were undergoing repair or reawakening after fighting in recent battles. The ravine was choked by multitudes of orcs going about their work, and thousands of moldering corpses piled up into a sea of decaying organic matter. Gold armor, darkened and soiled by waste, showed among the barricades of the looted dead. The dead Celestial Lions had been heaped into an undignified response with their Xenos murderers and their ceramite, useless to the junkyard heresy that constituted greenskin technology, was left to encase the rotting warriors amidst their flesh cairns. The Imperial force advanced over the sea of the disrespected dead, for tearing the barricade down was not an option. The guardsmen climbed and waded through the sea of bodies or rode on the hulls of their tanks. Above the advance rode the gunship fleet, all flanking the 4 remaining Thunderhawks in the Celestial Lion's arsenal. The moment they streaked through the ravine's trenches, cannon fire began to bring them down in tumbling fireballs. The Steel Legion did not balk at the sight of such vast enemy horde. They plowed into the enemy's disarrayed ranks, slaughtering them to make room on the fields of their bodies for the gunships to land. The first hours of the battle were unremarkable, only for their ferocity. The Imperial Guard massed cannonades devastated the greenskin war machines. In reply, the orcs butchered the guard at every point along the advance, where it fell to men and women with bayonets to hold the line. As was so often the way of the Astra Militarum, they had the stronger steel, but the enemy had the stronger flesh. In such grinding lock of armies, winning and losing was relative. The Imperial force pushed deep into the canyon as hundreds of men and women fell face down into the dirt. Behind the Space Marines lay a graveyard of tanks, practically all their own, all lost to the enemy cannon fire. Lining the canyon walls were the burning metal corpses of towering god constructs, hauled by missiles and tank shells, melting to slag in the flames of the Imperial Guard's bombardment. Stubber fire rattled against their ceramite harmlessly, beside guardsmen down in droves. Still, the Imperial advanced, sloshing through a rising torrent of blood. It was knee-deep on most of the humans, turning all advancement into a sweating wade through filth. Soon the pivotal moment of the battle came upon Grimaldus, as it had so many times before, his heraldry often drawing enemy commanders to him as often as he fought his way to them. It happened again at Mannheim, though he tried to avoid it. The largest of the orcs, doubtless hunting the Reclusiarch by heraldry, launched itself at Grimaldus from behind. It was a thing of blunt fangs, sinewy muscle, and hammering limbs, larger than Grimaldus, and both stronger and faster than him. A celestial lion called out to the Reclusiarch, reminding him that the orc warlord was the pride leader's kill. Grimaldus faced off against the massive beast, swinging his Crozius maul at the foul creature, but the powerful greenskin moved as if inhuman to everything thrown against it. Last fire lanced off the creature, going ignored against its armor, and equally ignored as the volley scored fingertip-sized holes in its flesh. Celestial lions charged the creature, but the hulking warlord countered their feeble assaults with a sweep of his mighty mangling claw. As Grimaldus was driven to his knees and eventually struck to the ground, Dubaku finally came between the two combatants with a leap and a roar. He held his hand back, binding Grimaldus to remain away. The Reclusiarch had to force himself to obey, something he would never have countenanced in any other circumstance. But they had fought this battle for a bloodline's pride, and here was the moment of reckoning. Dubaku beat his blade against the chestplate, staring at the greenskin lord in his powered suit of tank armor scrap. Despite the cacophony of battle that raged all around them, Grimaldus could hear the celestial lion's words as clearly as if they had left his own mouth. In whatever underworld your foul breed believes, you shall tell your pig-blooded ancestors that you died to the blade of Ekin of Elysium, Lion of the Emperor. No one knew it then, but at that moment, the pride leader was the last lion standing. Dubaku attacked, his chainsword worthless against the beast's claw. He had just little hope of parrying the creature's cudgel with his combat knife. So what he lacked in strength, he poured in speed, never blocking, always dodging. The battle did not pause around the two combatants. Soon both the pride leader and the orc warlord were bleeding from a score of wounds. The chainsword had found its way through the armor joints and plunged into soft tissue. The power claw had mangled the celestial lion's armor each time it fell. Soon Dubaku was backing away. Fighting such a beast was no task for one warrior alone, no matter the pleasure of pride. Then came a thunderclap of noise, as massive electrical bursts turned the air to charged static. Orcs and men in their droves cried out in pain at the sonic boom. The orbital shield was no longer functioning. Somehow, at some point in the hours of melee, while the Reclusiarch fought with the lions, the Steel Legion had laid explosives at the base of the Void Shield reactor. The Emperor alone knew when, where, or how. No sooner had the shield imploded, spitting its static charge in all directions, than a powerful and priority Vox channel run chimed loudly in the Reclusiarch's retinal display. Grimaldus activated as he watched the Pride leader and the Orc Lord stagger around each other, wounded animals too proud to die. Soon Grimaldus held a familiar voice. It was High Marshal Helbrecht. He informed the chaplain that the Black Templars were ready to reinforce their position. All he had to do was give the word. Grimaldus informed the High Marshal to blacken the sky. At that moment, the severely wounded Celestial Lion was down before Grimaldus could reach him. The beast clutched Dubaku's arm in its mangling claw, crushing it at the biceps before ripping it free. The Pride leader retaliated by ramming his chainsword in an awkward thrust through the creature's throat. Deflected by armor, it barely bit. His assault came at the cost of his leg, as the iron claw scissored through the limbs at his knee, dropping him on his back into the slime. Grimaldus was on the beast's back a heartbeat later, securing himself by digging into the creature's armor with his boots, as he wrapped his severed weapon chain around his bleeding, sweating throat. The chain garroted taut, crackling sinew in the beast's throat. The iron claw battered at the Reclusiarch, sneering chunks of ceramite away. It staggered without toppling, gasped without truly suffocating. Even strangling it with his last remaining weapon, could not kill it. All Grimaldus could do was buy Dubaku the moment he needed to crawl free, which he quickly did. And Cyrenaic was waiting, a bolter in his remaining hand. The mutilated lion reached up for it, clutching it one-handed in a pistol grip, and aimed it up as he lay back in the sludge. Grimaldus dropped back, not completely, but enough to pull the chain tighter, adding his weight to his strength. Retching the beast's head back to bare its throat. The bolter sang once, and the kick of something heavy struck near the chain. With a muffled burst, the orc's head came free, tumbling back over its shoulders and landing with the chaplain in the filth. The armored body stood there without anything existing above its neck, still too stubborn, too strong to fall. Once he got to his feet, Grimaldus reclaimed his maul from the fallen beast. Then he tossed the thing's slack-jawed head to Dubaku where he lay. The battle continued to rage, as the men and women Grimaldus had led there fought their way further down the canyon. Dubaku looked up at the darkening sky as the Black Templars descended in a massive drop-pod assault upon Mannheim Gap. The lion's only reaction was to rise as best he could and pull his helmet clear. He ordered the Reclusiarch to help him stand. He didn't want to meet the High Marshal on his back. Cyrenaic and Grimaldus hauled Dubaku up between them. While they did so, the guard's vox-link erupted in cheers as Lord Helbrecht blackened the sky with Templar drop pods. New beginnings. Reclusiarch Grimaldus bid his farewell to the newly instated chapter master, Eken Dubaku of the Celestial Lions, escorted by his surviving few warriors onto the Black Templar strike cruiser Blade of the Seventh Sun, with his course plotted for the distant world of Elysium 9. Dubaku now bore a bionic leg and a noticeable limp, his physiology not entirely adjusted to the augmentic replacement yet. The armor he wore was gold war plate of an ancient Imperial Fist champion, granted as a gift from the Eternal Crusader's halls of memory. His cloak was that of Helbrecht's own sword brethren, red on black, elegantly cast over one shoulder. It was not known if this was the very same cloak Helbrecht had granted to Dubaku when he forced him to take the oath of lordship over his depleted chapter. At his hip, bound by chains of black iron, was the flayed, polished skull of the greenskin warlord they had killed together. An honor indeed to be named a chapter master's prime trophy. The Black Templars' honor guard comprised, to bid him good journey, consisted of the Reclusiarch, the newly promoted chaplain Cyrenaic, and the High Marshal's household knights, clad in ceremonial colors. The Reclusiarch hoped most fervently, as time passed, that Chapter Master Dubaku's efforts in reconstructing the Celestial Lions and training the generation to follow him continued to go well. Grimaldus knew with grim satisfaction that they would most likely never meet again, as Dubaku was sworn to a life of defending what he could hold, and the Black Templars always sailed forth on the attack against the foes of the Emperor. Salamander's return to Armageddon. When Wa Ghazghul descended upon Armageddon in 998, many Space Marine chapters responded, as noted above, including the Black Templars, the White Scars, Exorcists, Silver Skulls, Iron Champions, Stormlords, Celestial Lions, and the list goes on. Their raiment every color under the Emperor's sun. Yet, of all those chapters that fought in the shadow of Armageddon smoke, wretched manufactorums and hive cities, the populace remember none with the same gratitude that they give to the Salamanders. The Salamanders had been instrumental in Ghazghul's defeat in the Second War for Armageddon, but victory had cost them dearly. Perhaps it was vengeance that drove the chapter to make such a generous contribution to the Third War. Whatever the reason, almost the entire Salamanders chapter was present in the crucial early months of the war. Under the eye of their bold chapter master, Tu Shan, they fought with determination on the most terrible battlefields. When the din of battle grew quiet and the orc attacks slowed, the Salamanders did not sit idle, but instead launched several devastating counterattacks against the rocks landed by the orcs again along the Hemlock River, preferring the close-quarter fighting to be had in the maze of crudely carved tunnels that lay within the interior of the rocks to the long-range duels in the desert. The Salamanders made their mark. By the start of the Season of Fire, 9 rocks had been destroyed by the Salamanders' attacks, killing untold thousands of greenskins. The glory of such battles was one shared with many other chapters, and alone it does not explain the fierce loyalty that the Salamanders engendered in the people of Armageddon. The truth of the matter remains that while some chapters fought for the Emperor, and others for the renown and glory to be earned, Tu Shan and his Salamanders fought each battle to save the lives of the people of Armageddon. For instance, during the battle for Hell's Reach, the Salamander strike cruiser Serpentine made its way through orbiting Orc Armada to vomit drop pods onto the shattered streets of Hell's Reach. Sergeant Vreth, commanding 70 Salamander battle brothers, fought alongside the Black Templar's Reclusiarch Grimaldus. Vereth's forces devoted their energies defending the helpless civilians caught up in the Hell's Reach siege. To the Black Templars' disgust, the Salamanders always made sure that their actions prevented civilian casualties, despite the inefficiencies this produced. While the Black Templars were always on the attack, while their differing styles of war put some strain on their relations with the Black Templars, Vereth and his forces ultimately departed the city for the banks of the Hemlock River. On more than one occasion, Tu Shan threw his Astartes into the most hopeless of battles to rescue embattled civilian enclaves and settlements that other imperial commanders had not been prepared to sacrifice for the sake of the wider war. Indeed, it is even rumored that Master Tu Shan himself came to blows with Captain Vinyar of the Marines Malevolent. Fitting, after it became known that the latter's men had shelled a refugee camp simply because there were orcs within its perimeter. This act alone won Tu Shan and his chapter much renown, though relations between the Salamanders and the Marines Malevolent have never been quite the same. The majority of the Salamanders departed Armageddon following the Season of Fire, but the chapter's work was not done. 2 companies of the chapter that remained behind on the Hive World did so to protect its major population centers from marauding orc warbands that would never quite be eradicated. The chapter's tech marines have been instrumental in repairing and rebuilding the infrastructure required to maintain such a vast amount of people, and it is certain that they have saved many thousands of lives with these vital but often overlooked duties. The people of Armageddon will not soon forget the efforts the Salamanders made in their name. The legend that the sons of Vulcan have left behind will surely shine all the brighter with every passing year. Uncertain future. The end of the Third War for Armageddon is clouded in mystery. Ultimately, the campaign was considered a narrow Imperial victory, as the world remained largely under control of the Imperium. Word later reached Yarick from the Black Templar's chapter fleet in orbit of Armageddon that Ghazghkull had fled the world once the planet's season of fire had begun and bogged down the Orcs' offensive, possibly in his command Space Hulk, the Perversion of Pain. With this news, Yarick gathered together his own forces and gave chase alongside the Black Templar's Crusader fleet, as the Black Templar's High Marshal Helbridge began a new Imperial crusade to seek out and finally destroy Ghazghkull. In a daring covert operation conducted by the 13th Penal Legion under the command of Colonel Schaffer, the traitorous former planetary governor Hermann von Straub was killed in the occupied Hive Acheron when he was tackled over the edge of a balcony by the demon-possessed Psyker, Lieutenant Cage. Cage had led the 13th Penal Legion into a trap, allying himself with von Straub in his possessed state, but had managed to overcome the demon's will just long enough to tackle the treacherous governor and prevent his comrade's execution. Both men fell to their death. Though the war is officially over, fighting still continues on the planet at present. Though Ghazghkull has left the world, pursued by Commissar Yarick, with a full Black Templar crusade at his back, the remaining Orcs have come to regard Armageddon as a kind of greenskin utopia, or Valhalla, where they can always come to find a good fight. As such, the Imperium must still send more troops into the stalemated battle to keep the planet in Imperial hands and prevent the seemingly permanent Orc infestation from becoming a major threat once more. Countless Orcs still infest Armageddon, and the conflict between human and greenskin continue to rage. For the Orcs, the war became known as the Big Scrap and Ragnarok, whatever. More Orcs arrived in the system with each solar day as word spread of the great battle raging there. The death toll for the Imperium spiraled towards the billions. The Imperials knew one thing, however. Whatever the cost, Armageddon must not fall. The state of Armageddon and its surrounding planets is currently dire. Billions of Imperial soldiers and citizens have died, and many of the hive cities of Armageddon now lay in ruin. The damage done to the world by the Third War for Armageddon is some of the most devastating ever suffered by the people of the Imperium. Dozens of Imperial armies were decimated or destroyed altogether by the ferocious combat, and the damage done to the planet itself may take Terran centuries to repair. Most of the settled planets in the Armageddon system have been ravaged by Orc forces, and with Ghazghkull having fled into deep space, it is likely he will quickly rebuild his forces and carve out a new Orc empire for himself. Unless the Black Templars and Yarick prove able to stop him. Not even the Great Warp Storm unleashed by the birth of the Great Rift in 999 could halt the fighting, but it did change its nature. During the period of the Noctis Aeterna, reinforcements were cut off from both sides, and those en route to the system were swept into oblivion in the warp. Those combatants who remained on Armageddon were forced to face not just each other, but oncoming waves of demons. At times, so desperate were the defenders that the Orcs and humans fought alongside each other against the greater threat. Such temporary ceasefire never lasted long. By the time the beacon of the Astronomicon burned bright once more, and easy travel to the Immaterium was possible in the Imperium Sanctus, an Imperial relief force arrived to find the landscape of Armageddon greatly changed. At the height of the warp storms, the demonic forces of Tzeentch and Khorne had battled each other as part of their eternal competition in the Great Game. The Orcs and the Imperial Defenders sought cover as titanic greater demons dueled for supremacy. Fully half the planet was reshaped into a hellish landscape, reminiscent of many demon worlds. A nightmare born of the warp emerged with the ruins of war-torn hive worlds. The Imperial reinforcements, led by elements of 9 Space Marine chapters, with the Salamanders in overall command, succeeded in halting a demonic ritual that would have brought Khorne, or Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, back to the world that had defiled him during the First War for Armageddon.